Kevin Jones is a consultant on workplace safety, a freelance writer, ghostwriter, reviewer, and blogger. He's been active in workplace safety since working in the Occupational Health and Safety Authority, the precursor to WorkCover in the early 1990s. He's spoken at international safety conferences, contributed to academic safety research, and written many articles on Australian safety and risk magazines. Kevin, take it away.
Thanks, Laura. One of the things that's been promoted a lot over the last couple of months with the impending publication of 45,001 is a lot of people have been claiming it's a game changer. And it is for some and it isn't for others. For those who are already on the safety journey and of workplace health and safety, it's not a revolution. It's simply an evolution. There are new elements, there are new tweaks, there are new perspectives on some of the criteria that's existed previously. So if you've already, on that journey and you already have an audit process, I don't think it's anything to be alarmed about. It is a game changer for some of those organizations who may be new to audits, or also those companies, and there are some, who are very complacent about safety. Who don't think it's of any great significance. They've been able to get by with what they've been doing. Suddenly a new criteria comes in where they have to be audited and they panic. There's also companies who I would think are too friendly with auditors. They might have had a contract with an auditor that's gone on for many, many years, and over time, their audit reports have become there's been a lot less non-conformances in those reports, and they've been a bit unproductive. So it does change. 45,001 is threatening for some, reassuring for others. Now, many companies are not interested in auditing their OHS management systems unless they're required to. And safety laws rarely require auditing of OHS, but it is considered to be a useful tool for verifying the safety management system and to identify any real holes in that system. But it is also important to not build a safety management system to the audit criteria, because then you're not managing safety. You're actually simply preparing for a test or an exam. Managing safety is so much more than audit of a safety management system. That safety management system, the management of safety needs to be effective, it needs to be workable. Auditing doesn't necessarily sort of encourage that. What it does do is it identifies when it's not working or how it can work better. So a motivator for auditing of OHS management systems in Australia is quite often tendering for government work, where governments require companies to match a performance benchmark, which in the past in Australia they've considered to be the Australian standard 4801, which came out in 2001. So it's quite an old standard, and it's out of sync with a lot of OHS expectations, even though it still fits the legislation. So I wanted to give an example here of one of those pre-qualification schemes. It's administered by the Victorian Department of Treasury and Finance. And I asked the register manager about the impending 45,001 and what difference it would make. Now, you can read the screen for yourself, but I just wanted to mention the second bullet point is that the register manager believed that there'd only be minor editorial updates, and there are no plans to change the current OHS requirements for public construction procurement. So it's not a big thing for them. They know it's coming in. And it's likely to come in, as you can see from the next bullet point, sometime in 2019. So the transition period is I would say generous in most circumstances, and the government seems to be on top of what's coming in with 45,001. So it's not going to be as disruptive to the government requirements. It shouldn't be disruptive too much to the tier 1 and the tier 2 contractors who apply for this work, because they're already on that journey of safety management systems and auditing. So it's, as I said before, it's an evolution, not a revolution in most circumstances. But there are a couple of new elements or a new emphasis on elements that could cause disruption and do require a reassessment of some of the management practices. Probably the one that's most obvious and significant is the element of leadership and commitment. Now, these two elements are already in OHS legislation. Safety begins at the top. There's accountability of senior managers for ensuring that safety management systems are operational and effective, those sorts of things. So it's already there. But even though something exists, it often can get ignored, or there are other priorities that contest with it. So this is where this 45,001, I think, can have the most significant impact on safety management. Because the auditors are going to be looking for the management, the executive, to take responsibility and accountability for the prevention of injury and illness. Now, that's a huge challenge for a lot of businesses, particularly after decades and decades of processes where the risk has been minimized, or the risk is being transferred, or it's, the contract tries to push responsibility and accountability for workplaces, health and safety onto others. So this is a major change. Again, it's one that reinforces what's already wanted by regulators and in legislation, but it would be challenging for many, and it will turn things on its head in some circumstances. I think also one of the important things about 45,001 is that health and safety is not separated from business operations. It's integral to company success and sustainability. So the next point means that the policies and the objectives need to fit with the corporate strategies. Quite often policies are produced and written for a specific purpose and actually conflict with corporate strategies, or even with industrial relations obligations. What this is pushing is for the OHS policies and the OHS managers to understand how OHS fits with the business, but also to have those other elements of the business accept the legitimacy of OHS policies and OHS priorities. So again, that could be quite challenging. Clear that the OHS needs to be integrated. The issue of sufficient resources is always contentious because of competing priorities in a business. But that's just something that needs to be negotiated too. And quite often, the resources shown to be insufficient are quite often after incidents. It's difficult to anticipate what are sufficient resources without bloating the OHS unit or the resources. It's very hard to balance that up, but there has to be a commitment to do that in this auditing process. Of course, you've got to communicate on OHS. I much prefer consultation rather than communication. Communication quite often implies a single direction of communication, where consultation means that you have to advise, but also to listen, and you have to build a relationship. So I think you have to communicate, but consult, I think, is better. One of the most significant changes, or the challenges in this group of elements, is that the leadership, the executives need to make sure the OHS management system is effective. This is an enormous challenge, and one that's not being driven by standards and by auditing, but it is it brings into this issue of, well, how do we identify the effectiveness of what we're doing? Is it simply the reduction of fatalities, or is it the reduction of serious injuries, or is it increased productivity, or is it that everybody's happy? Very, very challenging one to do, but it's essential to do it. And it's one that I would say that OHS profession has neglected largely in the past by being reliant on KPIs that have often been set by others and that really don't reflect any effectiveness of the management system, and is just a benchmark or a target to tick off. So making sure the OHS management system is effective, I think, is going to require a lot more work. And it's one probably where audits will find non-conformances. But partly that's because nobody, particularly in Australia, nobody's come up with any clear guidelines about how you manage how you identify the effectiveness of the system. So it's a government work one. It's one that needs to be worked on by industry associations and by individual companies. It's a very tough one, that, but it's essential if we're going to be supportive of the continual improvement requirements that are elsewhere. Jumping a couple of bullet points, organisational culture is important. Thankfully, they're not talking about safety culture. It's clearly an organisational culture that has some effect and some support to OHS. So that's important. You have to. The auditing element is to establish that. Well, it's still got to be effective in the long term, but establishing it, is right in the first place. Protecting workers from reprisals, I think, is understandable. But industrially may be difficult. And also there's the consultative mechanism that may involve committees. The nice thing is that it only may involve committees. It's not structured around committees. There are informal but still effective consultative mechanisms that can be used on health and safety systems. So leadership and commitment, it's great that that the standard is giving some clarity about what is going to be looked at. The magnitude of the challenge to meet those audit criteria is going to be quite interesting and challenging for a lot of businesses. Continual improvement is another element that's come to the fore in this standard. It's always existed, or it's always been implied in OHS legislation. It's always meant to be a step forward, a progression of OHS, an improvement of OHS. That's not always the case, that companies can achieve it, but it's the intention. And I think without this intention for continual improvement, you can just sort of say, well, that's how it is, and that's how it's always going to be. So there's no motivation for change. And I think that continual improvement is quite important. Culture gets a mention here in this, as it has elsewhere in the standard. The participation of workers in implementation of action. So you've got to have the people who are producing products and providing services need to be engaged in OHS elements, and we need to have systems and processes in place for doing that. Workers' representatives are an important element of continuous improvement and consultation and communication. But certainly in Australia, less than 20% of Australian companies have trade union representatives, which is where most of the workers' representatives have come from in the past. The standard doesn't talk about trade unions. If you've got somebody who can represent workers' needs and issues in OHS, well, then the audit supports it, as does the legislation. And so all of this integrated involvement and engagement will lead to continual improvement. Well, it could lead to extreme frustration for inaction, but that frustration is unlikely when everybody's engaged in the process. I'll just move to the next slide there. And management of change is an established process in some industry sectors. It's only recently come to the fore in occupational health and safety in the broad range of industries. But again, this is something that has been in the OHS legislation. Risk assessments are a core element of the legislation and of management. And every time you do a risk assessment, that risk assessment is done from the establishment of a process, but also when that process or the circumstances or the work environment changes. You have to reassess the risks. So management of change in some ways is a new label for risk assessment, but with an emphasis that it's not assessing the risks and that's all you need to do, but the purpose of the risk assessment is to look at how things are changing and how risks change as a result of changes in production in the workplace. So the management of change is very important. I think the legislative requirements are echoed in point A there, where new products, services and processes or changes, including all of those things, work organisation conditions change. We need to have a look at how we're going to manage that change and control the risks. So the processes need to be in place for how you do that. And I think, the first paragraph there talks about permanent and temporary change. It's the temporary changes that are the ones that are most significant in reducing the risk, I think, because if you're in a dynamic work environment, being outdoors or with a lot of people or where there's a great number of public, it's the change is occurring all the time. It's a continuously changing work environment. So how do you manage those processes? Complex work environment, a concept that is going to be challenging and new to some managers, but it's one that has to be addressed. I think also the last point there, changes in knowledge or information about hazards and OHS risks. It's critical in any business that you have somebody, not necessarily a formal position, but somebody who is the knowledge manager, who keeps their ears open and reads the internet and reads newspapers and all sorts of sources of information to look for things that could impact on your workplace. New products, new safety gear, new risks, emerging risks and hazards. All of these sorts of things is what the management of change elements is encouraging people to look at, because the environment is changing, the legislative environment is changing. You need to be on top of that. How do you know about these new things? And also, it's really important to be able to filter out the fake news or the fads or the short-term solutions, because you've got to be able to show that what you put in place is a part of an effective safety management system. Short-termism may work against that. So what to do? Well, the standard's only just been finalised, so there's going to be seminars, as this is probably an example of one, around the world about what's coming, how to respond to it, and all of that sort of thing. I think the main advice I've got is don't rush. The final standard's only just been published, and there is a transition period in most circumstances of 2 to 3 years before it may be accepted and implemented as a standard in your local jurisdiction. So there is time to reflect, and I think this is part of that building that knowledge management. Could be a substantial change to some businesses. So get to understand the standard, get to talk to people about the standard, consult broadly on it, and just keep your ears open about what's happening, particularly in your local jurisdiction. So do read up on the new standard and its impacts. For the Australians audience, and I'll put this to any of the listeners, is look at the standard context in terms of your own local jurisdiction, in my case, Australian sources. It is very easy to get distracted by things that are happening in other countries that are unlikely to happen in your own country. So give more attention to Australian sources than to international sources, even though this is an international standard. It's really going to become more applicable to you when it becomes a localized standard, and one that's integrated into the OHS laws and contracts and all of those sorts of things. I think it's important to ask questions of your regulators. They've known for ages this standard is coming. When your safety regulators have seminars and open days or conferences, ask them, a simple question such as what impact do they think that ISO 45001 will have on businesses in their jurisdiction? Just get an idea. Hopefully they know about it. I'm sure they do. But you'd get an indication about what they're planning for it and whether they see it as an enormous change or an enormous opportunity. Always important to talk with your colleagues. Don't rely on supposed experts. Talk broadly and listen to people and start the conversation. Critically, I think it's important to review your auditors. I mentioned early that some companies can become too cozy with their auditors. Just as you have to have an effective safety management system, an effective communication, so you have to have an effective audit program. So certainly I'd review your auditors at the moment and determine who you use and whether they are fully aware of 45,001, what processes they've put into place. Could they audit already to 45,001 as an academic exercise in anticipation of the introduction of that standard to your jurisdiction? Your auditors are your clients, or they provide you with the advice. Challenge them and make sure that they're ready for this standard and that they've got the suitably qualified auditors to be asking questions of your senior managers. Particularly on the issue of leadership and commitment, you need auditors who are good communicators, who listen and are respected, and actually know what they're on about. They're not just relying on the elements of an audit schedule or an audit plan. That they do know how this audit fits into the part of the OHS management system that the companies are talking about. So have a think. Would you have your current auditor, would you set them in front of your CEO and have them assess the leadership and commitment of that person or your executive team? If not, start talking to your auditors about improving them. Now, one thing that's not specifically mentioned, I don't think, in the standard is psychosocial risks, the issues of workplace mental health. It's not specifically mentioned because it is part of the criteria. I think it mentions it maybe in the scope at the very start, is that these are just workplace risks and hazards. It could be falling off a scaffold. It could be bullying. The safety management system has to be robust enough to deal with this very variable type of risk and hazard. So although it's not overtly mentioned and referenced all the way through all of the elements of the standard, have a talk to some people in your organisation and say, okay, well, how will we audit our safety management system for psychosocial risks? And does it fit? We'll also give you a good indication of who in your organisation you need to have as part of your audit team, your internal audit team. So, and talking about internal audits, start using it for your own internal audits and start looking at your own systems. There's a big difference between auditing and auditing for accreditation. I'm a big advocate of auditing your own organisations to standards because that's how the standard is. Unless you need to be accredited to that standard by an external auditor, that's a different process and a different situation. So start using 45,001 for your own internal audits and just determine whether your system's up to scratch. If you want to go external auditors for your own continuous improvement, that's fine. If you do have to go to them for accreditation, well, there's nothing much you can do about that. That's just the reality of the business. But the elements are already out there. The standard's already published. Start using it. So, just to wrap up, because that's almost the last screen I have, is I want to leave with effectiveness. Effectiveness is critical to ISO 45001 and to your safety management system. It's a big challenge. But it's also effectiveness of your auditors, of your audit process. It has to be effective. It's not a matter of, we're going to be audited to our elements. No, we've passed most of them and there's a couple of NCRs, that's fine. That is reflective. That is a look at what is already in existence, not necessarily an assessment of what you can build from. So audits are reflective, but the effectiveness of audits must be that how do they provide us with a solid platform to improve. It's that part of that continuous improvement. The audit standard wants you to look to the future based on the past. And so effectiveness is probably the phrase that I'd most like to leave you with, because it is critical to your compliance with your local OHS legislation, but it's also critical to the new ISO 45001.
Thanks, Kevin. This ends today's presentation. Thanks for listening.